All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the virtual panel with Women in Sports Data and Analytics. We are so glad that you are here with us tonight. My name is Jacqueline Mahoney. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Director of Operations and Strategic Planning at Sports Reference, the company that brought together this amazing panel of sports professionals tonight. Before I hand the mic over to the panelists, I just wanted to share a little bit about my background. So in 2016, before joining the sports industry, I was a doctoral candidate in public administration. I was a researcher in emergency management, and I worked for the United States federal government. And I know that it was 2016 because that's when Sue Bird published an article in the Players Tribune lamenting the lack of data and analytics in women's sports. Essentially, her argument was that it's difficult to have conversations about, who is the greatest of all time when you don't have data to back up your arguments. And if you can't have debates like that about women's sports, then they're not going to be given as much coverage. So I decided I'm going to do something about it. So that's my origin story. In addition to being an advocate for coverage of women's sports at Sports Reference, I also use my analytics background to help our leadership make strategic decisions by asking the right questions. And now I am so excited to introduce you to the rest of the people here with me tonight. We have Sarah Bailey from the LA Rams, Megan Chico with Stathletes, Kayla May with the Boston Red Sox, and Ivana Sherridge with Overtime Elite. So I will pass the mic over to you first, Sarah, and let you introduce yourself to our audience.
Yes, hello, hi, I'm Sarah. I am manager of football analytics with the Los Angeles Rams, Super Bowl champs. So adding that to the resume. I've been with the Rams for just about 4.5 years now, working with various data sources. We pretty much segregate into 3 different groups. We have coaching, we have personnel, and we have athletic training. So as a data and analyst there, on the football side, I get to deal with it all. We get to work with the coaches on a weekly basis during the season. We get to be heavy in the draft process, and we get to also work with our athletic trainers and our medical staff to keep our guys healthy and keep them fast and fit. My background in sports analytics, I kind of entered college with a little bit of a blank slate. I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I knew I liked math. And then a couple of years in, I kind of got asked, like, what are you going to do with a math degree? And what do you like? And just sort of had a ping in my head that was like, I like sports and I like data, and it was becoming fairly relevant. Moneyball was starting to gain traction in the movie world. So combined all those, and here I am.
We're so glad you're here with us. Megan, why don't you take it next?
No, don't make me go after the Super Bowl champ. I don't have that good of a story this year. But yeah, I'm Megan Chica, co-founder of Stathletes. We work primarily in hockey, mostly at the elite level, work with leagues, teams, players, agents, trainers for a wide variety of purposes. So, and I think too, the media and obviously sports books, betting side is booming as well. So I think, it's kind of the next iteration of data and analytics boom is on the fan engagement and communication side too. So seeing a lot of different use cases for the type of data that we built software to collect and try to work with great clients and grow hockey. So that's a bit about my background. And I was much like you, Jacqueline. I went to school for far too long. I think I was in university for 8 years. It was like, well, what am I doing here? I still actually hold a position at the University of Toronto too as a data scientist in residence at the lab. So they can't get rid of me. And I also recruited some interns from Sarah's alma mater, SFU, which has a great sports analytics program as well at a master's level. And they actually are Big Data Bowl finalists, so a hackathon for the NFL. So I hope no one hires them in football because I want them to stay in hockey, but we'll see. So yeah, a little bit about my background and just happy to chat with all the great people here.
Thank you so much. Kayla, what about you next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Kayla. I'm an assistant in baseball analytics with the Red Sox. My primary focus is in assisting our player development department. What that means really is that as players come in through the domestic draft, international signings, minor league free agent deals, what our group does is basically assist these players, in their journey, hopefully towards becoming major leaguers. That comes out through a variety of different things. So like we do player plans, performance reports. Baseball tech is a big thing right now. So like harnessing that tech and figuring out what to do with all that information. I started with the Red Sox back in 2018 as a baseball ops intern, where I was part analytics, part just general baseball ops stuff, doing whatever needed to be done. Before this, I was not very involved in sports or data science really at all. I worked as a consultant at a financial services company and kind of stumbled upon this through a very millennial thing. I saw a tweet about the opening with the Red Sox, and this was something I'd always been interested in. And I noticed that someone mentioned in the chat, like, how many people in sports are inspired by Moneyball, like also me. And so I was always really interested in sabermetrics, but quite honestly, like didn't know that there were jobs. Like I didn't know that was a real thing. And so in a way, I kind of stumbled into this, but it was always something that I'd really wanted to do.
Great. And last but not least, please, Ivana, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Ivana. I'm a strategy and research leader at the Overtime Elite. So I have a team of 3 amazing data scientists, and we interact with all other branches in Overtime Elite, from coaching, scouting, health performance and development, but also our social media team and our content teams. So we really do everything data related. So starting from collecting data in practice to tracking all our scouting reports and making sure scouts have easy and organized access to all their data. And we also work with like giving interesting data stories to our communications and our content teams. About my background, so I've always played basketball since I was 7 years old, and I've always also liked math. So I was always kind of in between math and basketball, never really knew which one to focus on 100%. So I always stayed in between. Ended up coming to the US when I was 19 for college, played during my undergrad, and then stayed for graduate school. Kind of like Sarah and Megan, spent way too much time in school. And somehow halfway through my PhD, I realized that the MBA teams were hiring data scientists, and I was studying computational fluid dynamics. So some of the skills were transferable, but I still had to actually learn, how to do all the data modeling. So I started taking online classes in my free time, and just to get some data science background. And 5 years ago, when I was graduating, I got the job with the 76ers, and I spent about almost 4 years there. And a year ago, actually, a year and 3 days probably, I joined Overtime Elite, and been there from the start. The original 5 when we started. So now we have over 100 employees. So we built up the league during this year, and we're also building up our data systems at the same time.
This is so fantastic. I am really excited about learning more from you all during this panel. So before the panel started, we had asked audience members if they would submit questions. Thank you to those of you who submitted questions. We tried to group them in main themes so we could touch on all of the themes that were brought up. But if more questions come to mind tonight, please feel free to use the Q&A feature to submit them. My amazing colleague Sam is monitoring that, so she will alert me if there are any questions that we can pepper into the chat. But we'll also aim to save about 10 minutes or so exclusively for audience questions at the end. So the first theme that kind of came out in these questions was the idea of storytelling. And so Ivana, I'll throw this to you first because you mentioned storytelling in your intro, but data and analytics are really useful tools for storytelling. Like on one hand, they influence how fans enjoy the game, and on the other hand, they influence how teams interpret the game. So I'm wondering how you use data and analytics to tell stories in your work. Do you have any tips about how to make sure your stories resonate?
Yeah, sure. So we focus on, because we work with young players, and our league is a little specific. We have our players. Just to give you a little bit of background, we have 27 players. They're divided in 3 teams, but we also play outside competition, and we play amongst our own teams. But we're really focused on developing our players for the next level. So also our stories and our data stories are also supporting the development, and we want to track as much as we can how are they developing, what's their baseline when they started, where were they halfway through the year, and where are they now that the season is at the end. So that's one of the big parts of where we use the data to tell the story of the development. Some of the tips I would say are, when communicating things with data, I would say always keep it simple. Always keep it to as you're talking to the fans. A lot of them are young and they don't, they haven't taken any statistics classes yet. So you want to get them interested in that and kind of draw them into getting excited about statistics and mathematics, because it can help them in life out, even if it's not for sports. But you have to keep it simple and try to make sure you're telling stories that are that people can relate to, because that's usually what draws the audience in.
Awesome. And just for people who aren't familiar, could you just give a brief overview of Overtime Elite? I know it's a new league, right? This past year.
Yeah, so we just started. The league has been announced a year ago, and we have built a new facility in Atlanta, in Atlantic Station. And the facility has been built from July until October. And it's quite an amazing place. We have 2 practice courts, the show court, a huge weight room, and also we have classrooms for our players. So Overtime Elite actually it includes the academics part, the basketball part, and also the social and social media part. And our student athletes are gaining their education. They're finishing their high school degrees, but they're also gaining life skills education. So they're learning about financial literacy. They're learning about social media advocacy. And at the same time, we have high level development on court. So we have some amazing coaches who work with our guys every day, multiple times a day. And at the same time, Overtime is a social media company, and we tell stories about our players and how they're navigating this world of elite basketball.
Awesome, thank you. I think that's useful context. So apologize to the rest of the panel for getting us off course just a little bit. But any other comments on using storytelling and data with your data and analytics work?
Yeah, so I think from like a professional aspect, a good example is looking at your players from the medical side. When you're flagging a guy and you can see like why he was flagged, and kind of can use the data as a way to represent his kind of week or his month or his cycle of training, and where he may be hitting his certain thresholds in different areas. And you can get a really good picture with data without having to like go back as an athletic trainer or as a medical staff or as a coach trying to remember like what happened on a certain day. We can use data to kind of point out those days that were maybe above average and like where he hit, and is it sustainable for him or not. And it gives a good story of what the player is in their terminology, that they can speak in yards and speed and their force and their power.
Fascinating. I wanted to, I'll definitely come back to you with our next question, because that sounds very interesting. Like there are a lot of like puzzles that you're essentially trying to solve through your storytelling, which is exciting. But I wanted to make sure Megan or Kayla, if either of you had a good example of how storytelling plays into your work as well.
I'm not sure if there's one example. I think both women, hit on the nail on the head with their answers on storytelling. I think keeping it simple for certain audiences, especially if it's media and you're looking at reaching a lot of people, but also maybe building on different concepts and using visualizations to help them understand maybe what's a bit more complex. Because I feel like we all want to be involved in sports, right? We don't want to be talked down to either. So I think data can do that quickly, right? Make you understand. You just turn on a game, it's midway through the match and you want to catch up. I think there's just so many use cases and reasons to use it in that storytelling process. But I think it just has to be mindful of the type of people and how it's presented. for it to be like accepted by the general audience and, you know, old school coaches and players that maybe have no interest. But like Sarah said, everyone wants to get better. Everyone wants to make more money. Everyone wants to stay in the league. So if you hit on their values and are able to communicate in ways they understand, I think pretty much everyone's receptive if it meets their end goals.
Yeah, I think what I had to say honestly echoes most of these thoughts. I wouldn't say that I really think about, you know, trying to tell stories specifically when I'm at work, but keeping the message simple, I think, is the message we're all trying to get across, right? You know, when we're building models or whatnot, interpretability is a huge, huge factor. In the cases of, you know, I want to be able to understand this, but also like if it's intuitive, if it makes sense to everyone else, like that's the easiest way to get buy-in. So by keeping things, you know, as transparent and as simple as we can, like I think that is kind of the same idea of what when we're talking about storytelling and getting the message across.
Awesome. So it sounds like some good themes are coming out here. And so I, you know, in terms of the keeping it simple and making sure it resonates with kind of the lowest common denominator of stats literacy, to bringing it up so that people who are very familiar with stats are able to use it to tell stories in their own language. I think that's the term you used, right, Sarah? So so the second kind of group of questions really builds off of that second point of thinking about like the real specifics, the nitty gritty of the data and analyses. Of course, this wouldn't be a sports reference event if we didn't have audience members who were very interested in the data and analyses. So Sarah, like I telegraphed, I'd really love to hear maybe about like one particularly interesting project that you had the opportunity to work on. You know, what did you do? What did you learn? How was it useful?
Yeah, so I guess if I'm sticking with the realm of what I kind of talked about in that sports science realm, I think and in the story, a project that we work on and we evolve is coming up with player alerts and the models underneath that are quite complex, but in a way that we can send out flash emails for players that reach a certain probability of injury risk or a certain workload overexertion, where it can be something as simple as like sending out, we build the base models and, you know, they consider like everything they do in the weight room, they consider their personal wellness, they consider their on-field work, they consider their hydration, their game mileage, are they practice squad, are they a regular player, what time of the year is it, are we in our first quarter of the season, are we at the end of the season, what was the daily practice, was it an intense practice, was it a deload day? All these models take everything into account that you can possibly think of. And then we kind of build it into pieces and we can separate it into groups, into those certain groups, you know, and send it out into one simple picture, something as simple as a green, red, amber color that a director can receive and all the athletic trainers can receive. And then maybe our sports scientists in the athletic trainer room, someone who is a little bit more nuanced with the data, doesn't necessarily build the models underneath, but is familiar with the terminology, then he can kind of open up that player and it'll, you can imagine, like this isn't literal, but if this is the red, it like splits into all those categories and they can again be seen like what is the focal point, what area did we flag this guy or what areas did we flag him. So it's one of those projects that is building, because the more data we get on these players, the more individual it can be. So you have a rookie and his information might be based on a positional average because we don't have data on him yet. And then you have a 5, 6, 7 year vet who is so personalized that we're fairly confident when we know he's outside of a norm that we would expect for him. So it's all kind of building into that. And I think it's a really cool project because it's proof of concept and how much it's used and how whenever I get a question, if someone like tries to open it up in the back end and I like pull up all the code and the modeling and they're just like, what the heck, how is this all in there? Like, I think that's something to be super proud of because you've simplified it so much where it's literally like a 1, 2, 3 scale, but there's so much more underneath it. And that's kind of like the story and the work behind some projects.
Thank you for speaking to that too. And Kayla, you had mentioned that you've been working on some building models too. So would you mind attacking that question about specific project you worked on, what you did and what you learned?
Sure. I actually recently worked on something I think kind of in the same vein of what Sarah's talking about, just like I guess, tracking the metrics for certain players. So something we've been looking at is basically creating a visualization of certain pitch metrics over time. So I think the simplest example would be, you know, has a pitcher's velocity changed, right? And so you can look at that exact number for every pitch very easily, but we've been trying to think of a way to better create a tool where we can identify significant changes in a bunch of other aspects as well. Like, as it's funny that we're talking about like data sources, because we get from MLB comprehensive play-by-play information. So like for every single pitch, every single thing that happens in a game, like we have very detailed information on it. You know, like spin rate for batted balls, exit velocity, for fielding, like we have the XY coordinates of every player at any given moment. Kind of freaks me out sometimes. But so like we get all that information, and something I've been working on is basically, and I'll mention this too, like I also use a lot of R and SQL. So like using those two things together to create a visually pleasing, but also useful plot for folks to look at and be able to identify, like, okay, like if there was a spike here, there was a dip here, like what happened that day? Like how do we, first of all, see if something different happened? And then the other tough part, I think, is that like there are so many pitches and so many things that happen in a game. Like how do we show all of this information on one graph in a useful way? So like it sometimes feels like almost like a big data problem of like, how do I deal with this much information at any given time and like make it useful? But yeah, that's kind of the essence of, honestly, a lot of what we do.
So obviously this is a focus on women in data and analytics. And so there were a good number of allies among our attendees who are just wondering how to support women and non-binary people in sports. And so this question is kind of a combination of questions we got from Claire D and Ross M. But what are some ways that leagues, teams, and other organizations can support women and non-binary people? And then what are some ways that fans can support that same group? I don't know if anybody wants to volunteer to take this one on first.
Sure. I mean, I think it's a complex, answer and question, and there's no, if we knew the answer to just write things, we would do it automatically, right? So I think it's just a work in progress where you see a lot more women getting hired. You see, especially in hockey, and you see just like programs that are meant to support people that are largely underrepresented. And so there's so many groups, right, in the past that historically haven't necessarily showed up in the front office. So seeing diversity, not just, of a couple groups, but in general, from what diversity truly means and a representation of the population. I think not only do teams be able to like understand and reach every fan, every group and connect with them, but I think it just strengthens groups as well. So I think a lot of organizations understand that. So from a fan perspective, obviously like engage, promote, retweet, and write articles and do all sorts of things, not just in the Women's Month, but every month, the other 11 months of the year, everyone's here at the same, we don't change the other 11 months. So I think just having a consistent effort and a game plan and a roadmap, both from an organizational standpoint, and then just from a single fan, I think it goes a long way.
Yeah, I love that. Anybody else want to jump in? Maybe things that you've seen at your organization that have been working well?
Sure, yeah. I was thinking about this question a lot beforehand, and in terms of, what leagues, teams, organizations can do, I feel like it's almost twofold, right? Both as an employer, but also as a very large group in a community, right? Like sports teams are not just businesses, they also mean a lot to the communities that they're in, the fans. And so from that perspective, honestly, something I just saw today, like I didn't know until I saw on Twitter today that it was Trans Visibility Day, which is great. I'm so glad I saw that, and now I know about it, and like here I am talking about it too. But having teams do these different nights, all the different things that they can promote on social media. Like, I think sports teams are a really big voice in the community. And so doing things so publicly, like shouting out the words, you know, it's Women's Night or whatever, like those are good things. Like that's going to get somewhere. People are listening. From the employment side, as you mentioned before, like something that we hired recently, someone that we hired recently, was a diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging specialist. So while in the past I'd like to think we've always made efforts to hire more diversely, I think it's very different to have that actual investment in having, you know, there's a job for this, like someone is very explicitly working on this every single day. And so that to me is very meaningful. Like I'm so glad we have that investment, but also just like from everyone else's perspective, like I've been with the Red Sox for a few hiring cycles now, and I realize that it's honestly, it takes a lot more work to find diverse candidates. And maybe it's a numbers thing, I don't know, but it genuinely takes more of my time. And that's fine. Like I'm so happy to do that work, but my thing is just like realizing that like we all kind of have to invest that extra time if we're trying to, you know, promote these efforts.
So I want to add a little bit. I really agree with what both Megan and Kayla said, and I would say there's a lot of improvement that's been made, and there are a lot more women being hired. But I would also think that we need to also make sure that that we are creating those inclusive environments so that the women who are hired actually stay there for a long time, instead of, you know, just leaving after a few years. So that could be small things or something really large, like for example, in many sports teams, in many, I guess, men's sports teams, you know, there's like a really small thing that you know, it matters at the end, but it may seem like a little bit like a small thing, but there's the team will give gear to the employees, and a lot of times there's not a lot of women specific gear, and you know, women end up wearing small men's size, which is fine for me, obviously, because I'm 6'2", but it's not exactly fitting most women. And another thing is you know, making sure there's a women's locker room. You know, there's a lot of sports teams will have locker rooms for staff because, you know, it's a gym, you can work out. So make sure that there's also a women's locker room, which seems obvious, but it's not always the case. Another thing is also a lot of arenas will not have a place for visiting female staff to change. So things like that are really, it may seem small, but are making a big difference of making the women who are already hired there to feel included. And I want to bring out a shout out to Women in Sports Data event that is going to be hosted by the Brooklyn Nets. It's organized by 3 amazing women in sports data, and I will share the link in the chat. And there's going to be a hackathon, so anybody can join and get some exposure to working with the data and you know, participate in the conference.
Thank you for sharing that. Sarah, I wanted to give you a chance to speak to if you have anything to say on this topic.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone kind of said what I would think. I think the only other thing to add is I think a lot of organizations right now are bottom heavy on their diversity quotas. And in order to really make actionable, impactful change, like women and women and people of diversity, we need to be at the top of the pyramid, so that you can bring into actionable items to where like you're a figure at the front, and kind of what Kayla was saying about how, you know, maybe you have an imbalance in the type of people that apply for certain jobs. So if there's a bigger focus in that forefront and the people that are in charge, then, you know, it's automatically encourages more women and people of color and whoever you identify with to apply, because you can see them and you can see the success they've had. And also, when you're in a position of power, you have the right to change. I know, like, from my perspective, like, if you're at the bottom, like, you can't hire women because you don't have the power to hire in general. You can't hire anyone, but you can't even try and make those changes until you reach a certain level. So I think as organizations, we have to keep like creating a pipeline to get women on the top, and kind of what Ivana was saying, like getting them to stay so that that pipeline can continue to grow and you can get them in positions where you know, they have more power and more control to change some of the rules and some of the biases that exist.
Yeah, and I also wanted to say, like, some that's been coming up as I've been listening to these things as another woman who works in sports is, you know, sometimes just like feeling like you're a woman in sports, feeling like you don't really belong is not like a malicious thing. Like I remember this, like, there's just different ways of communication that really shocked me when I was the first woman to work at Sports Reference. And it just felt like this barrier I wasn't prepared to handle. And so one of the things that I really appreciated from my colleagues, and also speaking to this idea of like, how can fans support women and non-binary people in sport, it's just like, we notice when people say things, right? Like, we notice when people come out in support of women. We notice when people say nasty things about women, and making the place feel like Ivana said, like a place I can stay for a long time is something that you know, everybody can be a part of just making sure that that it's not weird to see a woman in the room, so that it becomes the norm. And so I think that fans can have a good space in that too, of just making us feel welcome in that space. So speaking of women in sports, there's another kind of elephant in the room, which is women's sports. And so this question came in from Isaiah L. And I know, Megan, you just got back from the Isabel Cup finals, so I wanted to start with you. But Isaiah was wondering, what implications does the growth of coverage of women's sports have for data analytics?
Well, and I think, like we were talking earlier, you know, data and analytics can really help in storytelling. It can help in media. It can help in connecting people to athletes, following athletes, their careers, what's going on. You know, it's something that I think goes back to even like sports cards, right? People used to like look at hockey cards on the back and look at the stats. So I think if you're not collecting any data on women's sports, you're really missing out, because you're missing a part of that group that really just loves to pour over, you know, a certain player or how the game went, or even just young people that are learning math and using sports to do that. So I think you can engage at a much younger age with a nice data set that's presented well, that's very usable. That's why I try to make as much women's data that I have public as I can, because I think it's great to see people, you know, universities use it in their classrooms and hackathons use it, because typically, you know, the capital is not there to, you know, work that intensely in terms of these different wearables and, you know, computer vision and all these other collection methods that we have. So, you know, women's sports kind of gets to the side of that whole party. And I don't really think that's fair or desirable, right, for the growth of sports. I think we all grow together, and without seeing women rise in both, you know, on the field, off the field, I don't feel like really feel like we belong. And I see a lot of the comments to women athletes very similar as the comments I get in business a lot of the time. So I think that there's that joining there, that, you know, we can really break some of that structural really damage that's been done over decades and decades of, you know, just keeping up with the status quo. And you really see like lower investments in women's sports. It doesn't take a lot to get involved, to help support teams, to work on teams, the lower barriers to entry. So I think there's a lot of disruption that women's sports leagues can do and are trying to do. You know, we see that in soccer now and hockey as well. And we always think of the big women's sports like tennis and golf as being sort of the beachheads of, hey, these make as much of the men's in some of these tournaments now. So it's like, why not these other sports that are also, I mean, women's hockey is one of the most viewed events at the Olympics. If that doesn't say something, then what does, right? So there's something that doesn't carry over, and I think we all need to work together to solve that problem.
Awesome. And I know, Ivana, you also worked, or you also were a college athlete in women's sports. So I wanted to throw this question to you as well. Are the trends similar as the ones that Megan mentioned in hockey and basketball?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, just looking at the men's NBA versus the women's NBA, there's a lot more data for men's NBA. Also looking at men's and women's college, it's a lot easier to find college data on men's side. And I know Basketball Reference is working on that project. So great work. I can't wait to see that. So yeah, I mean, finding women's basketball data it's really not that easy. And there are a few websites out there like Her Hoop Stats. It's a really good website, really good place to find WNBA and NCAA stats on the women's side. But yeah, obviously the lack of data is not helping the storytelling, and as I can't remember who mentioned this, but this when Subert said that there's you just can't tell who's the best player because you don't have the data on that, or like who takes the most charges on women's game. Like we don't know, we just don't know because we don't have the data, and there's that big data gap on the women's side in basketball.
The first one was about Moneyball and some stories about how scouts weren't really believers in stats. And so there was a question, I guess, Kayla, we can start with you since Moneyball is in your realm. But how have analysts and scouts really learned to coexist since those times?
That's a really good question. I think for I'm sure for every organization it's different, and I've only ever worked here, so I have my singular experience. I personally don't think it's quite as antagonistic as I don't know, I guess the media narrative lends you to believe. I think we do a really good job of combining both of our talents. I definitely don't know thousands of things, millions of things that the scouts know and see and know, like think about every day. And so I think it would be pretty arrogant, ignorant. I'm not sure if if us on the analytics side were to simply dismiss scouting the same way that I think honestly it'd be a little rude if they just dismissed analytics. But like an example I always like to give is that like catcher framing, that's like a relatively new metric that we measure and look for. But I think relatively recently, that was something that scouts had always seen. Like there are catchers who are good at stealing strikes. That's like a skill that you can work on, and there are folks who are better at that than others. And I think before we had all of the, like pinpoint strike ball data, that was something that like felt almost silly, right? Like, oh, like how can we know? Like umpires are good at their jobs. Like how is someone stealing a strike? But there can't be like probabilities for if something's called a strike or not. Like that seems silly. Like these are professionals. But as we get that data, we realize like, oh my goodness, like this is a real skill set. And so it's something that I think analytics caught up to scouts on. And so, like that's a huge thing now. And I think that's a good example of how, you can never just dismiss something that a lot of people are seeing.
Awesome example. So another question that we got here is about analytics and gambling. So just like the link between the two industries. I don't know, Megan, I remember you mentioning gambling during your introduction. I don't know if you have any insights into that linkage.
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually on the board of advisors of one company called US Integrity, and it's meant to look for any sort of like discrepancies in of sports books. So kind of on the nice side of the sports books in terms of making sure that there's not issues. But I would really say I saw this, the data analytics boom was really about gambling. I mean, before that ruling was overturned, we couldn't do any sort of sports books that weren't through different like casinos or other entities in North America. So I'd say no. And I'd say a lot of leagues and people that are really into data analytics don't necessarily even like betting, right? I mean, that's just a totally different mindset and use case. And I think it's really far outside of what someone does for performance, because you're not, even like if you think about different types of bets, it's not really about who will win or lose or how to make people better, right? It's just like, literally prediction or maybe even just burning your money in some cases. So I think in areas and like Australia has always like loved betting, Ireland, the UK, there's a lot of like European countries that it's just like part of their kind of fabric of sports. And, you know, April 4th. So I think we have 3 days until it goes live in Ontario where I am. So we'll see how that shakes out as well. But there's certainly a lot of people, a lot of capital on that side, but very different than, you know, a traditional analytics department would look at.